The World Bank officially declared Vietnam and the Philippines richer nations this year, but the workers actually building that wealth might tell you a different story. On paper, both countries just cleared the threshold into upper middle income status. Underneath that shared headline sits a real income upgrade, a real value chain gap, and one uncomfortable line item neither government's growth chart accounts for. Act 1, a scholarship, a threshold, and a question. To understand how two Southeast Asian nations crossed the same economic line at the same moment, we have to look past the headline numbers. This story begins not in a government ministry or an international summit, but with a single student, a national exam, and an economic threshold crossed in the same month of July 2026 for both countries at once. Her name is Hoang Huong Giang, and she did everything right. She scored among the top results in Vietnam's national upper secondary exam, and that result earned her a Samsung-funded scholarship to study computer science at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, known as KAIST, South Korea's top technical university. Her path from a Vietnamese classroom to an engineering lecture hall in South Korea is not an accident. It is exactly the outcome Vietnam's government has been trying to manufacture at scale for years, proof that domestic talent can compete at the very top. But turning one exceptional student into a national industrial transformation is a very different challenge, especially with millions of workers still on the assembly line. That academic milestone landed in the same month the World Bank made something official. On the 1st of July 2026, the World Bank reclassified both Vietnam and the Philippines from lower middle income to upper middle income status. Vietnam's gross national income per capita reached $4,970. The Philippines posted $4,850, both cleared the new threshold of $4,636 with room to spare. A university scholarship and the World Bank spreadsheet update do not obviously belong in the same story. But Jiang's path exists because of the same forces that just pushed her country up a tier. The real tension sits in the gap between what one exceptional student represents and what most Vietnamese factory workers actually experience every day for far less recognition. As World Bank researchers put it in their own release notes, Vietnam and the Philippines reached the identical threshold through completely different roads. What neither government's press release mentioned is that the harder stretch of development starts now, for both of them, and the easy gains are already behind them. Act 2, one built a factory floor. The other grew everywhere at once. To see why the next phase is so difficult, look at the two economic engines that got each country here. One built a massive export-driven manufacturing floor tied to global technology giants. The other grew across multiple domestic sectors at once. Same income classification, two very different structural vulnerabilities underneath it. Vietnam's upgrade has a name, and it is Samsung. The South Korean conglomerate has invested more than $23 billion in the country and employs roughly 87,000 people there, concentrated in Bac Ninh province. In one decade, Bac Ninh went from rural farmland to Vietnam's single largest destination for foreign direct investment, reshaping the province's entire economy in the process. That industrial build-out powered an export-driven growth engine, with shipments surging through 2024 and 2025. Vietnam's gross national income grew at roughly 10% a year between 2021 and 2025, a run the World Bank itself called one of the strongest sustained growth stretches anywhere in the region. The Philippines took a different route entirely. Its income growth was not powered by one dominant company or province. The country's own Department of Economy, Planning and Development points to broad economy-wide gains as the real driver, a reading the World Bank's own classification notes confirm. Electronics and semiconductor manufacturing still did real measurable work inside that broader story. That industrial footprint runs through the Philippine Economic Zone Authority, or PEZA, whose electronics and semiconductor manufacturing sector alone accounts for a substantial share of the country's approved investment and several 100,000 jobs. One recent example makes the scale concrete. Japanese components manufacturer Minebea Mitsumi announced a 25 billion Philippine peso expansion in June 2026, projected to create 3,000 new jobs. Two countries, one shared number on a World Bank spreadsheet, two genuinely different economic engines underneath it. That difference decides what breaks first, if momentum ever stalls, and it shapes exactly what the next several years are going to test, for both of them in very different ways. Act 3, the same milestone, a very different next test. Crossing the threshold into upper middle income status turns out to be the easy half of this story. The real test begins when an economy tries to climb from middle income to high income, where cheap manufacturing alone no longer delivers growth. The distinct choices that brought both countries here are exposing very different vulnerabilities underneath the same shared headline. Each development model has left a different gap exposed. For Vietnam, the vulnerability is technical skill and where the country sits on the semiconductor value chain. For the Philippines, the bottleneck is structural governance and reform. Left unaddressed, either gap could stall the momentum both countries have just built. Nearly all of Samsung's operations in Vietnam and the wider electronics cluster around it sit in assembly and testing, the lowest value end of the semiconductor chain, not chip design or fabrication. Vietnam does not yet have substantial domestic capability at those higher stages. The government has set a target of 50,000 semiconductor engineers by 2030. The current workforce is a small fraction of that number. Sending exceptional students to elite institutions like KAIST is the government's bet on seeding engineering talent from the top down. It is a genuine strategy and a real investment in the country's future. It is also, by definition, not something that scales to the tens of thousands of engineers the actual target requires. Individual brilliance does not build an entire domestic pipeline on its own. For the Philippines, the obstacle is structural rather than educational. A 2026 survey by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, flagged the same concern Filipino economists have debated publicly for years. Without faster reform on ease of doing business, infrastructure spending, and education investment, the climb to high income status could stretch across decades rather than years. Professor Quang Minh Vu of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore called this joint upgrade a highly encouraging milestone, real international recognition of both countries' progress. But he also warned that both economies are now walking directly into the classic middle-income trap, the well-documented pattern where wages rise faster than productivity and growth quietly stalls before a country ever reaches the next tier. Act 4. What the number doesn't count. A gross national income figure captures a national average, but averages hide what is happening on the ground beneath them. They cannot tell the difference between a scholarship and a shop floor. In this next part, we look at exactly what that number does not count. If both countries manage the next phase well, the optimistic path is straightforward. Vietnam builds its engineering base fast enough to move from assembly toward chip design. The Philippines delivers the reforms the OECD is asking for, and its broad-based growth keeps compounding rather than stalling out. Under that scenario, both countries could realistically reach high income status within a generation, a milestone neither had a serious claim to a decade ago. But in March 2026, the Korean labor rights group SHARPS published an investigation into working conditions at subcontractors around Samsung's Bac Ninh complex, the very same facility driving the export numbers behind Vietnam's entire upgrade. The investigation documented continued toxic chemical exposure at those subcontractor sites, building on a 2023 account from a former 40-year Samsung safety manager who spoke out under a pseudonym for his own protection, and an earlier documented case of a young worker collapsing at a related facility in Thái Nguyen province. None of this makes Samsung's presence in Vietnam a bad thing on balance. The investment, the jobs, and the export growth are real, and they genuinely lifted the country's income figures. But the speed of that scale-up has, in documented cases, run ahead of the labor and environmental oversight needed to match it. A rising national average does not know the difference between a KAIST scholarship and a subcontractor's shop floor. It only knows the average. Act 5, the milestone was never the finish line. Reaching upper middle income status turns out to be the end of one chapter, not the finish line. Both countries are now discovering from their own institutions that the milestone was the easier part. Vietnam has scaled the low end of a high-value industry faster than it has trained the engineers to climb it. The Philippines has grown broadly and genuinely, while its own economists debate how many years of reform stand between here and the next year. For the Philippines, that remaining distance cannot be closed by momentum alone. The growth is real and broad-based, reaching sectors well beyond electronics. But the country's own leading economists are still debating how many more years of structural reform on business regulation, infrastructure, and public education actually stand between here and high income status. As for Hoang Huong Giang, she will finish her degree at KAIST in a few years and most likely do exactly what her government hoped: come home with skills Vietnam's semiconductor industry badly needs. Her story is the promise of a country trying to leap into the knowledge economy, one scholarship at a time. What happens to the tens of thousands of workers on the factory floors that made her scholarship possible in the first place is a different story, one still being written. Their names will never appear in a press release or a World Bank update, and nobody in either government has put a timeline on how it ends. The ASEAN angle covers Southeast Asia's biggest economic and policy stories, clearly, independently, and without the noise. I am Hero the Hornbill, and this is the ASEAN angle. If this episode gave you a new way of seeing the region, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. New episodes weekly, link in the description.